Did you know that there's a Yakuza game set in 17th century Japan that blends real historical figures with the iconic characters of the Yakuza universe that we never got a release of here in the West? And no, I'm not talking about this one, I'm talking about the one that came many years before it, Ryuga Gotoku Kenzan. This was not only the first spin-off of the series that we would never see released outside of Asian markets, but also was the first Yakuza game ever made for the PS3. And it's pretty safe to say that this is also the least accessible game in the franchise, as the only way to play this game is to import a copy from Japan and experience the entire thing fully in Japanese. But luckily for us, after playing Ace Combat 3 for the channel about a year ago, another game that was part of a series I wanted to dive deeply into that was only ever released in Japan, I decided to really dedicate myself to learning the Japanese language just so that when a situation like that came up again, I could properly cover the game. Now, obviously, you've probably heard that the Japanese language is incredibly difficult to learn for a native English speaker like myself, but I've genuinely studied it almost every single day since finishing up that Ace Combat 3 video and developed a pretty good understanding in that amount of time. So I went ahead and got myself an imported copy of Kenzan, played through the entire thing while managing to understand the majority of the game's story and systems, and I now feel pretty well equipped to cover the game properly. And at the risk of playing my hand too early, I've come to find that Kenzan is a massively underappreciated gem that deserves to be talked about way more within the Yakuza community. So buckle up as we take a look at the Yakuza game that we never got. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the third in a series of videos where I'm playing every game in the Yakuza series for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. And while you don't have to have seen the first couple videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with those games and my thoughts on them if you haven't seen them. So for those that are interested, I'll have the full playlist in the description below for you to go and check out there. But with that out of the way, Ryuga Gotoku Kenzan is an action-adventure game developed and published by Sega for the PlayStation 3 in 2008. The game is set in Kyoto, Japan during the early Edo period. More specifically, it takes place in the year 1605, so it places it pretty much right at the beginning of the Edo period. In Kenzan, we play as Kiryu Kazuma Nosuke, a man living in Kyoto's Gion district. And I'm sure that I don't have to point this out to fans of the series, but Kiryu Kazuma Nosuke has a very similar name and face to the Kiryu Kazuma who we play as in the first couple games. This is actually something that pops up all throughout Kenzan, with characters from the first two games essentially being slightly tweaked and adapted to the setting of the Edo period before being dropped back into the story. I won't be calling out every single one of them throughout the video, as we genuinely spend just a few minutes talking about those characters, and it feels sort of unnecessary. Plus, I'm sure those of you familiar with the first two games will notice them on your own anyway, and those of you who aren't probably don't care, so we're just gonna move past it. Getting back on track though, in Kenzan, Kiryu works as a sort of police officer here in Gion, but he'll also take on just about any odd job that comes his way, so long as the person requesting the job is willing to pay him accordingly. One day, a young girl named Haruka shows up out of the blue and asks Kiryu to kill a man named Miyamoto Musashi for her. She explains to him that Musashi killed her whole family and that she's the only survivor, as well as that a strange man told her afterwards that she should travel to Gion and find a man named Kiryu. And after learning that Kiryu will do just about anything people ask of him so long as he's paid in return, she sells herself to a local brothel to earn the money to pay him. And this is where the real historical figures start coming into play. Miyamoto Musashi was a real Japanese swordsman from the Edo period who has gone down as a legend thanks to his unique double-bladed swordsmanship and undefeated record in his 62 duels. And he's only the first of many legendary swordsmen and martial artists from the time who make appearances throughout the game's events. Again, I won't be bringing up every single one of them by name because we'd be here for quite a while if I did, pretty much just doing an Edo period history lesson, but if you're someone who knows a decent bit about the history of Japanese swordsmanship, you'll definitely appreciate how many notable figures appear throughout the game. And I should also take this quick opportunity to nip a common myth in the bud here. Haruka sells herself to a local brothel to pay Kiryu to kill Miyamoto Musashi. However, she is not a child prostitute in this game. She sells herself into slavery where she becomes a kamado, which was a title within Japanese brothels of this period that roughly translates out to young female student. These girls would live at the brothel they were purchased by, but their day-to-day work would be to do the basic everyday chores around the brothel rather than interacting with customers directly. In return, they would receive training and education from those within the brothel who had more status than them, which would often lead to them becoming prostitutes themselves once they reached the age of 16, which was the age of consent in Japan at that time. So despite what you've probably heard about this game, we aren't dealing with child prostitution here. Instead, we're dealing with child slavery where these girls would effectively be groomed into becoming prostitutes once they were of age. Which obviously is still far from great, but the team at Sega were simply trying to give an accurate portrayal of Japanese history. Kenzan doesn't shy away from showcasing the darker sides of this time period in Japan in the slightest, with the game's opening cutscene showing players how children would be sold into slavery by their families, and Kiryu later giving a speech about how broken these children often grow up to be as a result of it. So if you've ever heard that Kenzan portrays Haruka as a child prostitute and makes some sort of weird glorification about it, just get that out of your head right now, because that's simply a misconception from people who don't actually understand the history that the game is portraying. Anyway, after Kiryu hears the name Miyamoto Musashi, we get a flashback to 5 years earlier where we see Kiryu training in a dojo. While training, a man enters the dojo and says that he's looking for Miyamoto Musashi, as he wants to recruit him on behalf of the Tokugawa clan's army to fight in the Battle of Sekigahara. Kiryu tells him that he is the man named Miyamoto Musashi and decides to join him in the battle. So we learn pretty early on through this flashback that Kiryu's real identity in this game is actually Miyamoto Musashi. Once recruited, he and the other soldiers are told that there's a secret mission to kill a traitor that they need 2 volunteers for. But the catch is that taking this mission means there's an incredibly high chance that they won't return alive. Musashi and another man named Gorohachi Majima volunteer themselves for the job, but after they've killed the alleged traitor, they learn that this target was actually the son of the leader of the Tokugawa clan. They flee to the appointed rendezvous point, where the man who recruited them appears with other soldiers and reveals that this secret mission was actually a setup. Majima and Musashi attempt to escape from the soldiers, but after a few days of running from them, Majima ends up sacrificing himself so that Musashi can get away. To honor his friend in death, Musashi goes to find Majima's sister Ukyo so that he can pass his sword on to her. But when he does so, some bounty hunters looking for Majima appear, and Musashi decides to defend her from them. After this, the two of them fall in love, and Musashi swears to never pick up his sword again so that they can live a peaceful life together. After a few months though, more bounty hunters appear looking for Majima, and Musashi is unable to fend them off with just his bare hands. This leads to Ukyo grabbing Musashi's sword out of the house to try to protect him, but she ends up being killed by the bounty hunters as a result. As she's dying, she tells Musashi to take up his sword again and use it to protect others, before leaving him to wander aimlessly once again. He eventually finds Gion and sees that it's a district in need of protection, settling down there and changing his name to Kiryu Kazuma Nosuke, which ultimately brings us back to where we are in the present. From here, Kiryu is left to figure out who the imposter is that's going around and using his name to kill people. The story has all the twists and turns that you might expect of one with that sort of setup, and honestly, it's easily my favorite of the 3 games so far. It doesn't faithfully retell the life of Miyamoto Musashi or anything. In fact, if you know anything about the guy, you'll already be able to see just how far the story deviates from his actual life, even in what I just described. But it uses his legend as a base to tell a completely original story in a really fun way. It's an amazing story about a man who's desperately trying to move forward in life, but who's being haunted by and pulled back into his past every step of the way. And it's easily the most emotionally invested I've been in any of these stories so far, with it being the first game in the Yakuza series to almost make me shed some incredibly manly tears near the end. If you're a fan of the Yakuza series' stories, I would definitely recommend that you check this one out. Even if you can't play the game for yourself, there are actually some videos here on YouTube where creators have played through the entire main story and manually translated the whole thing into English for their videos. Which, while obviously not the ideal way to experience the game, it does at least lower that barrier of entry for a lot of people and make it possible to experience the story even if you don't speak Japanese yourself. Getting into the game itself though, you've probably already noticed by now that Kenzan looks considerably better than Yakuza 2 did. As this was the first game in the series that was made for the PlayStation 3, the team had a lot more power to work with when it came to the game's visuals, and they've made pretty good use of it here. The environments are all modeled and textured in much higher detail, characters' faces have now been modeled off of their voice actors, and everything is being displayed at a much higher resolution thanks to the PS3's more powerful hardware. Everything here just looks significantly better than the first two games, but the one complaint that I do have is that the depth of field effect they're using seems to be pretty low quality. So in a lot of the game's areas or cutscene shots, you'll notice this weird haziness in the background that almost makes it look like it's being displayed at less than 720p. Nitpicks aside though, it looks pretty damn good for a PS3 game from early 2008. And a lot of the areas in the game are a lot more nature heavy than what we saw in the first couple, which is something that I really appreciated here. But let's finally get down to the two things that really make or break a Yakuza game, with the first of those being the combat. The combat here in Kenzan feels basically the same as Yakuza 2 at a fundamental level, but there are some big changes here that leave it feeling totally distinct at the same time. Things like the lock-on system, the general flow of combat, and other basic aspects of it are all basically unchanged, but then there's the fact that we play as a samurai in this game. So instead of primarily using your fists to take down your enemies, you'll be using your swords. You can collect and equip a variety of different swords throughout the game, and each of them will fall into one of 4 categories. The first of these is the katana category. I know, samurais using katanas. Shocking. These blades are amazing against single targets and smaller groups of enemies, and they also happen to have the largest attack pool out of any combat style in the game. They do struggle a bit against larger groups of enemies due to how easily they'll end up surrounding you, but if you want to play through the entire game just using this basic single-bladed stance, you certainly can. In fact, I probably played almost half of the game just using the basic katana stance. Then there's the wakizashis, and I'll just tell you guys straight up that these aren't very good. They have the lowest damage output out of all the different weapon types, and while they do have some solid defensive options available, there are other sword styles that have better defensive options and are just more capable of actually dealing with enemies. So while they can be pretty fun to use here and there, they might just be the weakest weapon type in the game. Hell, I would even say that just using your fists is probably better than using these. Getting into the spicier options though, there's Musashi's signature 2 swords as 1 stance. This is a stance that makes use of both a katana and a wakizashi together, which easily makes it the coolest looking style in the game. The offense and damage output in this stance are pretty solid, but where it really excels is in the defense. The biggest defensive bonus that this stance has is that it can block attacks coming from any direction. So if an enemy suddenly ends up slipping behind you and trying to get a hit in while you're positioned poorly, all you have to do is just hold the block button to completely negate the attack's damage. It might not have as many unique attacks as the single-bladed stance, but the defensive abilities are so strong, and it also has some great crowd control capabilities. So overall, it ends up being easily my favorite stance out of the bunch, and I probably played about half of the game using exclusively the 2 swords as 1 stance. And finally, there are the various great swords of the game. These swords are so heavy that Kiryu can barely move around while wielding them, but they have some of the best crowd control and damage output in the game. So if you're ever getting swarmed by a massive group of enemies, it just might be worth whipping one of these out to quickly deal with them. The downsides of the great swords are pretty massive though, as not only do you basically lose the ability to move, but there's a complete lack of defensive techniques available to these swords. So basically, you end up getting the best damage output in the game, but also leaving yourself completely open to enemy attacks. It definitely has its uses, but it's not really my kind of combat style, so I didn't end up getting a ton of use out of it during my playthrough. The sword fighting and the various styles here in Kenzan really spice up the combat after a couple games of just beating the crap out of guys with your hands. Which, don't get me wrong, you can still use your hands in combat here, and they are a solid option, but the swords are just so much more fun to me. There are a lot of little intricacies here that just make things more interesting than they used to be, like how you can't block against sword attacks when unarmed, and each sword stance also has a smaller or larger amount of what the game calls sword pressure, which is basically just a stat that tells you how easily your sword will break an enemy's guard when they're also using a blade to defend against you. There's also the new Zanshin mechanic that allows you to hold down the attack button after landing a blow on an enemy to charge your heat. This introduces a fun little give and take where you can leave yourself open to enemies for a short time in exchange for generating some extra heat. And if you haven't already, you'll probably see me doing it quite a bit in my footage here whenever there's an opening for it. The final thing I want to mention about the sword fighting here in Kenzan is that it makes the game play much more defensively than Yakuza 1 or 2 did, which honestly just makes sense given the setting of the game. When fights in Kenzan are these tense duels between legendary swordsmen, it really just makes sense for the game's combat to be more slow and methodical to match that. We could spend pretty much all day talking about how much the introduction of the sword styles impacts the combat here, but I'll just sum it up by telling you guys that it's a really fun evolution so that we can move on to some other things. Aside from that, the only real addition to the combat here comes in the form of gourd enemies. These are enemies that, as the name suggests, have a gourd hooked on their belt that contains a consumable item. If you want to get your hands on the item they're holding, you'll have to target the enemies with the gourds first, since if you kill them after all the other enemies, the fight will just end and you'll lose access to that item. These guys add another fun twist to the combat early in the game, though once you've gotten enough upgrades and money, you won't really need to target them anymore outside of some extreme situations. Overall though, I'm a pretty big fan of Kenzan's combat. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily any better or worse than the combat from Yakuza 2, but it has a really unique feel to it compared to the first couple games, and I think that I might have a slight personal preference to the combat here because of it. As far as the other thing that makes or breaks a Yakuza game, in my opinion, it's the quality of the open world and the side content outside of the main story. And this is where I feel Kenzan really shines in comparison to the first two games. Kenzan's open world is much larger than what we saw in the PS2 entries, yet it still feels super tightly designed and absolutely packed to the brim with meaningful content. The Gion district that Kiryu lives in feels very similar to something like Kamurocho from previous games, with it being the largest entertainment district in Japan at that time. But Gion is just one small piece of the overall world here in Kenzan. Do me a favor and take a quick look at this map. This is the world map here in Kenzan. Each of these labels is one full area that you can visit, and while they're not all equal in size or the amount of content within them, the best way that I can give you an idea of the scale of Kenzan's world is by telling you that the entire Gion district is just one of these areas. So the game's total open world is basically just a series of smaller, more intentionally designed maps that have been stitched together, which works really well for upping the scale of the world while still retaining that core Yakuza feel. And of course, it wouldn't feel like a proper Yakuza game without a wealth of side quests and mini-games to tackle outside of the main story. The game has a total of 119 side missions for players to find out in the open world, which is exactly one less than Yakuza 2 had, but as you'll continue to see throughout the video, Kenzan's world offers much more content than that game's, just in other areas. And the side missions are probably the best they've been in the series so far, with my favorite that I found during my run being one where Kiryu is chased into a theater by some bounty hunters who recognize him as Miyamoto Musashi. One of the women in the theater tries to put him in full makeup so they won't recognize him, but when they get there, they spot him right away regardless. So, Kiryu decides to take them out on stage while in full makeup and beat the shit out of them with a giant umbrella as the audience cheers him on, thinking it's just part of the play they were there to see. This is just one great example of how this game's side quests are overflowing with personality, and I ended up completing way more of them here than I ever did in my playthroughs of the PS2 games as a result of that. Kenzan also has a ton of minigames that feel appropriate for the period it's set in. For example, Shogi returns both as a gambling game and also with a fun new twist on it in the form of Shogi trials. These are unique setups where either the player or the opponent starts at a significant disadvantage and need to find a way to squeeze out a victory. I'm still awful at Shogi after trying to learn how to play it for the first time in Yakuza 2, but these trials actually helped me quite a bit with learning how to take in all the information on the board and view things from a different perspective than I would in a normal game, which actually helped me get quite a bit better at the game during my time here in Kenzan. I'm still pretty bad at it, but that's a good step up from being terrible at it, so I'll take what I can get. There are also some traditional Japanese gambling games here like Koi Koi and Chinchirorin, which I was completely unfamiliar with before playing. Chinchirorin is a dice game that's actually really easy to pick up and play within like 5 minutes, but Koi Koi is played with Hanafuda cards, which of course I have never encountered before growing up in America. So it's a lot more to actually try to pick up and learn for a Western player like myself. But I actually had a blast with both of these games during my playthrough, and admittedly spent a little longer in the gambling dens than I really should have. But to give proper context to the rest of the minigames, we first have to talk a little bit about how the progression works here in Kenzan. Players familiar with the PS2 Yakuza games will know that the experience earned from fights and side quests can be used to purchase new skills. There were always 3 different progression tracks to choose between, so players would basically have 3 different options of new skills to choose from every time they leveled up. But here in Kenzan, they've totally ditched that system. Every time you gain enough experience to level up, the game will do so automatically and give you a small increase to your maximum health and attack damage. There are still plenty of techniques and abilities that you can pick up during your playthrough, but every single one of these will come from either training in a dojo or completing certain mini-games rather than just from leveling up. The dojos are pretty straightforward, effectively being the same as training with Kiryu's martial arts master back in the first Yakuza game. You'll go to talk to the master of the dojo, do a short little training exercise either with them or other members of the dojo, then gain the new ability in return. This is a really fun way to gain new abilities here, as it really does make you feel like you're training to become a better samurai. But then on top of that, there's Kenzan's various training minigames that are all an absolute blast. You'll be doing things like practicing your horseback archery to hone Kiryu's focus, playing this hilarious little meditation rhythm game to help him reject his worldly desires, or even becoming the legendary fruit ninja to learn new techniques. And in the event that they don't give you a new technique, they'll do something like up your heat gauge by 1 bar, or make it so that when you're at low health, you'll start to gradually regenerate heat even when not attacking enemies. The minigames are all super fun in their own right, but the fact that they so directly contribute to your progression by giving you new techniques and passive buffs make them feel incredibly rewarding on top of that. Yakuza 2 experimented with this a little bit by giving some smaller bonuses to Kiryu for completing certain challenges in various minigames. But Kenzan takes that idea to the extreme and makes the minigames into a core piece of the game's progression. You can genuinely tell how much or how little time someone spent training during their Kenzan playthrough just by looking at some footage of their combat. But that's not the only way to earn new abilities while out in the open world. On top of everything we've gone over so far, there's also the introduction of what the game calls revelations. These are moments while Kiryu is out in the open world where he'll see something in nature that inspires him. Players will be shown a short cutscene and have to complete a QuickTime event sequence during it, but if they can do that successfully, a few different possible takeaways from what we just saw are available to choose from. If players can choose the right lesson out of these various options, Kiryu will then whip out a piece of paper for some art and calligraphy, which will then inspire some new sword techniques for him. This is a really fun way of unlocking new techniques, as not only does it feel incredibly appropriate for the game's setting, but the real-life Miyamoto Musashi was also an artist and calligrapher on top of being a swordsman, so it feels appropriate for the character as well. Overall, I really enjoy how Kenzan ties its progression into the open world. I'm sure there are plenty of players out there who play the Yakuza games just for the main story, and more power to you if you do, but I personally loved the way that Kenzan incentivized me to take regular breaks from the story to go and explore everything else the game had to offer. There were moments during my playthroughs of the PS2 games where I would end up just wanting to blast through the main story and come back to the side content later. But here in Kenzan, the sheer amount of things to unlock out in the open world prevented that from ever happening, which I think is a huge positive. I wouldn't necessarily be upset if future Yakuza games went back to just giving players new abilities through leveling up, but I would definitely love it if future titles leaned more into this approach instead. Outside of that, there's more to the open world that we don't need to dig too deeply into, but that at least deserve a quick mention. Firstly, there's a whole bounty hunting system here that players can participate in if they need to make any extra cash during their playthrough. There are roughly 20 bounties to track down and collect throughout the whole run of the game, with extra rewards being available if you can take them in alive. Which is really fun since it means that players will need to fight some of the toughest enemies in the game without using any of their blades. It's a fun little addition that definitely has some room to be expanded on in future titles, but it's nothing to really write home about here in Kenzan. Then there's the swordsmithing system. Any sword that you find out in the world can be refined and customized at a blacksmith using materials that you earn as rewards from various side missions. During my playthrough, I decided to take some of the weakest and most brittle blades that I had found and refine them as much as possible, and by the end of the game, I had some incredibly powerful weapons that each literally had their own aura to them. Probably the best thing about this system is that you have to pay a blacksmith every time you want to refine a blade a little bit, which obviously isn't the most convenient thing, but I found that it gave much more of a purpose to actually making money in this game. Typically in the Yakuza games, I feel like you really only need money to buy some consumable items or maybe go to the hostess bars, but here in Kenzan, your money is actually a key part of your progression since it can upgrade the gear you're using. I doubt there will be anything like this in the rest of the Yakuza games that I haven't played yet, as you don't exactly play as a samurai in the vast majority of them. But this could definitely be a great thing to see in a game like, I don't know, Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii? Just saying, Sega? Overall though, I think Kenzan has my favorite open world and collection of side content from the series so far. Like I said before, I'm sure there are players that won't be as big on it as I am, particularly those who enjoy more of a focus on the main story, but for people like me who enjoy the side content of these games, this is a major step up from the PS2 titles. It's easily my favorite open world of the 3 games I've played so far, and I hope to see some of what made this one stand out to me so much appear in the later Yakuza titles as well. And I could actually say something very similar about Kenzan as a whole. This game takes a lot of big risks compared to the first couple titles, but I felt that the majority of them ended up paying off and leading to this being my favorite Yakuza game so far. The story was easily my favorite, the combat was a slight upgrade from Yakuza 2 with a fun twist on top of that, and the open world felt much more deep than it ever did on the PS2. I honestly enjoyed it so much that it makes me sad to think about how the series will never go back to this style. Well, I guess it will at least one more time, but for the most part, it's back to the classic Yakuza formula after this one. If you've seen my videos playing Yakuza 1 and 2 for the first time, you'll know that I really enjoyed those games as well. But there's now a part of me that will definitely always be yelling on the internet about how we need more samurai-themed Yakuza games. And it's a damn shame that this game is so inaccessible for Western fans, as I would love for more Yakuza fans out there to get to experience Kenzan the way I did. So here's hoping that we get some sort of localized re-release or remake someday. But at the end of the day, I'm going to give Ryuga Gotoku Kenzan an 8.6. Hey guys, thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. I'm sorry this one took so long to get done after my Yakuza 2 video, but as I'm sure you can imagine, playing through a roughly 30-hour RPG in a language that you've only been studying for a year can be a bit of a slow process. As always, I'll have some links on screen and in the description for my support platforms if you want to join the incredible group of people who make gigantic series like this one possible. But this video's already taken up enough of your time, so I'm gonna get back to work on the next one instead. Thanks again for watching, guys, and I'll hope to see all of you right back here for the next Yakuza review.